Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to start work on a very basic form of trunk lock. This lock is purely functional. There's no decoration really to speak of. It's basically just designed to keep the lid closed on a box and keep people from snooping around your stuff. Brazing in the fire is a really good way to assemble small parts. We're going to be using it to assemble the key for our lock as well as the ward plate. The ward plate is an internal part of the lock that the key has to fit around to reach the mechanism that opens the lock. The plate is just a piece of 16 gauge sheet metal, and the collar is made by wrapping a thin strip of 16 gauge around the bar stock that I used for the key. The key is made up of 3 separate parts, and we're going to be brazing all of these parts together in the fire. The main shaft of the key is made out of a 1/4 inch rod. I need to cut a slot at one end that the bit is going to fit into, so I've drilled a couple of holes to rough out most of that material. Next I'll use a narrow chisel to break out the web in between the 2 holes and create a slot. Brazing in the fire is similar to soldering a plumbing joint. The molten metal is sucked into the joint by capillary action. So a good mechanical fit is essential because that's what gives you the strength of the weld. There's no buildup on the surface the way a brazing joint would be with an oxyacetylene torch. The next step is to file a small tenon on a piece of flat bar. This will form the bit of the key that actually moves the mechanism inside the lock. You want the fit between the 2 pieces to be tight enough so that they hold together, but still sloppy enough so there's still plenty of room for the metal to flow inside the joint. The strength of the joint comes from molten metal flowing into the joint and filling all the crevices. So you really don't want a perfectly machined joint. Rather than brazing rod, I've always used just plain copper wire. I think the tensile strengths are fairly similar, and certainly copper is a lot easier to get a hold of and a lot easier to work with than brazing rod. I certainly have had no trouble with anything I've ever brazed with copper. As you can see, unlike conventional brazing with an oxyacetylene torch, the filler rod is wrapped around the joint and the whole unit is placed in the fire. The flux is applied just as soon as the metal is hot enough to melt it. Once again, we're using 20 mule team borax as the flux. The flux coats the metal and prevents it from oxidizing. As well, it helps to lower the melting temperature of the copper. When the copper melts and becomes liquid, it flows underneath the flux and bonds to the clean metal of the joint. For that reason, it's very important that the entire joint be brought up to temperature very slowly. You want a good even heat right through the entire piece. You actually want the steel to melt the copper, not the heat of the fire. If you let the piece heat up too quickly, the copper will melt and simply flow on the surface. It won't be sucked into the joint. So even though the fire looks white hot, I'm keeping it just under the melting temperature of the copper. As you can see here, the copper is just about ready to melt. I'm getting the piece to a yellow heat, but you can still make out the faint line of the copper wire which still hasn't melted. Unfortunately, the heat of the fire is making it impossible for me to get a clear shot of this, but when the copper is just about ready to go, it has a really iridescent look to it, and then all of a sudden it just disappears off the surface and flows all over the place. That's when you'll see me move the piece from side to side to try to get the metal to flow evenly through the whole joint. Now that the bit is complete, I can start working on the bow portion of the key. Once again, I'm creating a very simple joint that is simply designed to increase the surface area between the two pieces being joined. The bow is made from a lock washer that I hammered flat and shaped into an oval. Sometimes you need to wire pieces together to keep them in place in the fire. This shot was taken before I threaded the copper wire around the joint. The wire does get brazed into the finished joint, but it really doesn't take that long to clean up. And here's the key roughly fitted to the ward plate. Next time we'll be assembling the rest of the lock. We'll see you then.